My wife dumped me months after our wedding because her mom said I wasn't good enough. You're nothing without my daughter. She can do so much better. She hissed. I just laughed and left. Now she calls me 10 times a day, sobbing and begging me to take back her broke, miserable daughter. So here's the thing about happiness. It's like that perfect slice of pizza you order at 2 a.m. when you're drunk on love and terrible decisions. It tastes absolutely incredible in the moment, but you know deep down it's going to give you heartburn later. My name is Marcus Ellison, and man, was I about to get the worst case of emotional indigestion known to mankind. Picture this. There I was, standing at the altar in a rented tux that smelled faintly of the last guy's cologne and desperation, looking at Clara like she'd personally hung the moon and stars just for my viewing pleasure. The whole wedding thing wasn't exactly what you'd call a Pinterest-worthy affair. We're talking community center reception, cash bar, and my cousin Jerry doing double duty as both photographer and DJ, because apparently multitasking runs in the family. But you know what? I didn't give a damn about any of that superficial garbage. Clara looked absolutely stunning in her dress. Nothing fancy, just something simple and elegant that she'd found on sale at David's Bridal. Her smile could have powered the entire electrical grid of our dinky little town. And when she said, "I do," I swear my heart did this ridiculous little flip that would have embarrassed the hell out of me if anyone could actually see inside my chest. For those few precious hours, standing there with the vows still echoing in my ears like some kind of beautiful soundtrack, I genuinely believed nothing could touch us. We were invincible, bulletproof, the kind of couple that old married folks would point to and say, "Now that's real love right there. Oh, sweet summer child Marcus." If only you knew what was coming down the pipeline. The months that followed were like living in one of those cheesy romantic comedies where everything's bathed in golden sunlight, and everyone's perpetually happy for no apparent reason. Clara and I moved into this tiny apartment that was basically a shoebox with delusions of grandeur, but we made it work. We're talking hand-me-down furniture that had seen more action than a Vegas wedding chapel, my grandmother's ancient couch that creaked every time you breathed on it, a dining table that wobbled like it had developed a drinking problem, and a bed frame that made more noise than a freight train during our more intimate moments. But here's the crazy part. I absolutely loved every second of it. There's something weirdly romantic about building a life together from scratch, even when scratch means your entertainment center is made of milk crates and your idea of fine dining is deciding between Chinese takeout and pizza delivery. We'd spend our Sunday mornings walking through Riverside Park, holding hands like a couple of teenagers who'd just discovered physical contact, talking about our dreams and plans for the future like we actually had our shit together. Clara would point out houses we'd never be able to afford and say things like, "Someday, babe, we're going to have a place with a real backyard and maybe even one of those fancy refrigerators with the water dispenser in the door." And I'd nod along, thinking to myself that I'd be perfectly happy living in a cardboard box as long as she was there to share it with me. Love makes you stupid that way. It's like emotional alcohol that impairs your judgment and makes you think karaoke is a good idea. Our evening routine was pure domestic bliss, the kind that would make single people either incredibly jealous or slightly nauseous. We'd come home from our respective jobs. Me from the insurance office where I pushed papers and tried not to fall asleep at my desk. Her from the boutique downtown where she sold overpriced clothes to women having midlife crises. And we'd collapse onto that ancient couch together. Sometimes we'd order Thai food and binge-watch Netflix until our eyes crossed. Other times we'd just talk for hours about absolutely nothing and everything all at once. Clara had this laugh that could make me forget about every crappy thing that had happened during the day. She'd snort a little when something really tickled her funny bone, and then she'd get embarrassed about snorting, which would make me laugh, which would make her laugh harder, and before you knew it, we were both practically hyperventilating over some dumb joke or stupid meme one of us had seen online. It was ridiculous and perfect, and absolutely everything I thought marriage was supposed to be. I remember one particular evening when we were sitting on our fire escape, which was basically our version of a balcony, since actual balconies were for people with money, sharing a bottle of cheap wine and watching the sunset paint the sky all these impossible shades of orange and pink. Clara was wearing one of my old college t-shirts that was about 3 sizes too big for her, and she had her hair pulled back in this messy bun that somehow made her look even more beautiful than she did all dolled up for work. You know what I love about this? She said, gesturing at our pathetic little kingdom with her wine glass. It's ours. Nobody can tell us how to live or what we should want or whether we're doing it right. It's just us figuring it out as we go along. And that's when I knew, or thought I knew, that we were bulletproof. That whatever challenges life threw at us, we'd handle them together like some kind of dynamic duo of domestic happiness. I mean, we'd already survived the stress of wedding planning, the horror of combining our stuff into one tiny living space, and the awkwardness of learning each other's bathroom habits. What else could possibly test our bond? But here's the thing about happiness that nobody bothers to mention in all those self-help books and motivational Instagram posts. It's fragile as hell. One minute you're living your best life, thinking you've got everything figured out, and the next minute reality comes crashing through your door like the Kool-Aid man's evil twin, ready to mess up everything you thought you knew about love and commitment and trust. Because while Clara and I were busy playing house and thinking we were untouchable, there was this voice lurking in the background, waiting for its moment to strike. A voice that belonged to someone who'd never approved of me in the first place, someone who'd been biding her time and sharpening her claws, ready to sink them deep into the foundation of everything we'd built together. That voice belonged to Clara's mother, Loretta. And let me tell you, that woman was about to become the villain in my personal horror story, the kind of monster that doesn't need fangs or claws because words can cut deeper than any blade ever could. But for now, in these last moments of blissful ignorance, I was still Marcus Ellison, the happy husband, the guy who thought love could conquer all. Little did I know that some battles aren't won with love, they're lost with silence. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and immediately sense that everyone's been talking about you? That weird, prickly sensation that crawls up your spine like a spider made of pure paranoia? Well, multiply that by about 1,000, add a hefty dose of passive-aggressive Southern charm, and you've got yourself a front-row seat to my first family dinner with the Whitmore clan. And let me tell you, it was about as comfortable as wearing a wool sweater made of poison ivy. Loretta Whitmore never liked me from the get-go. I'm talking about the kind of instant, visceral dislike that some people reserve for root canals or tax audits. The woman took one look at me and decided I was about as welcome in her family as a vegan at a barbecue competition. But here's the kicker. She was way too classy to just come out and say it. Oh no, that would have been too easy, too honest. Instead, she wrapped her hatred up in a neat little package of politeness and served it to me with a smile that could have frozen hell over. The first time Clara brought me home to meet the parents, I was nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. I'd spent the entire drive over rehearsing conversation topics in my head, trying to think of ways to impress this woman who'd raised the love of my life. I brought flowers, nothing fancy, just a nice bouquet from the grocery store, and I'd even ironed my shirt twice to make sure I looked presentable. Clara kept squeezing my hand and telling me everything would be fine, that her mom would love me once she got to know me. Sweet, naive Clara. If optimism were a superpower, she'd be running around in a cape saving the world from cynicism. The Whitmore house was exactly what you'd expect from people who used words like summer as a verb and thought Target was where poor people shopped. It wasn't mansion-level wealthy, but it had that whole upper-middle-class vibe going on. You know, the kind of place where everything matches and there's not a single piece of furniture that came from a garage sale. The front lawn looked like it had been manicured by a team of perfectionist landscapers, and I'm pretty sure their driveway was cleaner than most people's kitchen floors. Henry Whitmore answered the door, and for a split second, I thought maybe this wouldn't be so bad. The guy seemed decent enough, firm handshake, genuine smile, the kind of dad who probably coached Little League and grilled burgers on weekends. He was wearing khakis and a polo shirt that screamed, "I play golf, but I'm not obnoxious about it." And he immediately started asking me about the drive over and whether I wanted a beer. Normal dad stuff. I was starting to relax when Loretta appeared. Sweet Jesus, this woman was a piece of work. Picture your stereotypical country club matriarch, the kind who's never met a charity gala she didn't want to chair or a social hierarchy she couldn't climb. She was perfectly put together in that way that probably took 2 hours and a small army of beauty products to achieve, wearing the kind of outfit that looked casual but probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her smile was surgically precise, like she'd practiced it in the mirror until she could deploy it as a weapon. Marcus, isn't it? She said, extending her hand like she was doing me some incredible favor. How lovely to finally meet you. Clara has told us so much about you. The way she said so much made it sound like Clara had been confessing sins to a priest, and I was pretty sure none of those confessions had been particularly flattering. Dinner was like being interrogated by someone who'd watched too many episodes of Law and Order and thought they were qualified to cross-examine witnesses. Loretta asked questions about my family with the kind of surgical precision that would have made a detective proud. Where did I grow up? What did my parents do for a living? Did I have any siblings? What were my career aspirations? Each question felt like she was building a case against me, collecting evidence that I wasn't good enough for her precious daughter. When I mentioned that my dad was a mechanic who owned his own shop, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not disgust, exactly, but something close to it. Like I just told her I came from a long line of professional nose pickers, or something equally offensive to her delicate sensibilities. How? Blue collar, she said, and somehow managed to make it sound like a diagnosis of terminal illness. My mom being a nurse's aide didn't fare much better. Oh, how noble, Loretta cooed. But there was nothing noble about the way she said it. It was the kind of praise you'd give a child for trying really hard at something they were obviously terrible at. Clara shot her mom a look that said, "Behave yourself," but Loretta just smiled that plastic smile and moved on to the next item on her list of ways to make me feel like garbage. The worst part was Henry's reaction, or lack thereof. The man sat there through the entire character assassination, sipping his wine like he was watching a mildly interesting documentary about paint drying. Every now and then he'd nod along or make some generic comment about the weather, but he never once stepped in to defend me or tell his wife to dial down the hostility. It was like he'd perfected the art of selective hearing, tuning out anything that might require him to actually take a stand. Clara, bless her heart, tried to steer the conversation towards safer topics. She talked about work, about our apartment, about the places we'd been exploring together. But Loretta had the conversational skills of a shark. She could smell blood in the water from miles away, and she wasn't about to let her prey escape without taking a few chunks out of it first. Your apartment, Loretta said, seizing on Clara's attempt at deflection like a cat pouncing on a wounded mouse. Clara mentioned it's in that interesting neighborhood downtown. How quaint. The way she said quaint made it sound like we were living in a condemned crack house instead of a perfectly respectable, if modest apartment complex. By the time dessert rolled around, I felt like I'd been put through an emotional blender. Loretta had managed to critique everything from my education to my choice of footwear without ever saying a single directly insulting word. It was masterful, really, the kind of psychological warfare that would have impressed military strategists. She'd made me feel about 2 inches tall while maintaining plausible deniability the entire time. When we finally left, Clara apologized for her mother's behavior, but she did it in that way people do when they're making excuses for someone they love. She's just protective, Clara said as we drove home. She wants to make sure I'm with someone who can take care of me. And because I was stupidly, blindly in love, I believed her. I told myself that Loretta's attitude was just maternal concern, that once she got to know me better, she'd see that I was good enough for her daughter. Looking back now, I realized that was the first shadow falling across our perfect little world. The first crack in the foundation that would eventually bring the whole thing crashing down around our ears. But at the time, I was still operating under the delusion that love could overcome anything, even a mother-in-law who'd already decided I was the human equivalent of a participation trophy, technically present, but ultimately worthless. You ever watch one of those nature documentaries where some predator slowly stalks its prey? The kind where the gazelle is just minding its own business, munching on grass and living its best life, completely oblivious to the fact that it's being hunted by something that's patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Well, congratulations, you're looking at the gazelle in this particular wildlife special, and Loretta Whitmore was the apex predator who decided to make me her next meal. The thing about psychological warfare is that it's not like getting punched in the face. A punch hurts like hell, but at least you know you've been hit. What Loretta was doing was more like being slowly poisoned. Each comment, each suggestion, each perfectly timed observation designed to eat away at my confidence and my marriage from the inside out. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and the woman wielded criticism like a master swordsman wielded a blade. After that first disastrous dinner, I thought maybe things would settle down. Maybe Loretta would back off once she realized I wasn't going anywhere, that Clara and I were solid, and her little intimidation tactics weren't going to work. But I'd seriously underestimated the woman's commitment to making my life miserable. She wasn't just some overprotective mom having a hard time letting go of her baby girl. She was a woman on a mission, and that mission was getting rid of me by any means necessary. It started small, the way these things always do. Little comments here and there that seemed innocent enough on the surface, but packed more venom than a rattlesnake with anger management issues. Clara would come home from having lunch with her mother, and suddenly she'd be looking at our apartment with new eyes, critical eyes. Mom mentioned that the Hendersons just bought that beautiful house on Maple Street, she'd say, and I could practically hear the unspoken comparison hanging in the air like a bad smell. Our little place, which had felt cozy and perfect just hours before, suddenly seemed shabby and inadequate. Yeah, well, the Hendersons also inherited a small fortune from his grandmother, I'd point out, trying to keep my voice light. Last I checked, dead relatives weren't exactly handing out trust funds to insurance adjusters. But Clara would just shrug and change the subject, and I could see Loretta's poison starting to take effect. The woman had an opinion about everything, and somehow every single one of those opinions was designed to highlight my various shortcomings as a human being. My work schedule was too unpredictable. Apparently, staying late to finish important projects showed a lack of work-life balance rather than dedication. My wardrobe was too casual. The fact that I wore jeans and button-down shirts instead of three-piece suits was evidence that I didn't understand how to present myself professionally. Hell, even my hobbies weren't safe from scrutiny. Marcus still plays video games. Loretta asked Clara during one of their weekly phone calls, her voice carrying just enough disapproval to make it clear that she thought grown men who owned gaming consoles were essentially overgrown children who'd never learned to adult properly. Never mind that I played maybe 2 hours a week, usually when Clara was working late or hanging out with friends. Never mind that it was my way of unwinding after dealing with insurance claims and angry customers all day. In Loretta's world, real men apparently spent their free time doing manly things like chopping wood and fixing cars with their bare hands. But the worst part wasn't the direct criticism. It was the way she managed to plant seeds of doubt in Clara's mind without ever actually saying anything overtly horrible about me. She was like a master gardener of discontent, carefully cultivating insecurity and watering it with just enough truth to make it grow. "I just want you to be happy, sweetheart," she'd tell Clara. "You deserve someone who can give you the life you've always dreamed of." And because Loretta was smart enough to never actually specify what was wrong with me, Clara couldn't really defend me without sounding like she was defending something that hadn't actually been attacked. It was psychological jujitsu at its finest. Loretta would make these sweeping statements about what Clara deserved: a man with real ambition, someone who could provide stability, a husband who understood the importance of appearances, and then she'd sit back and let Clara's imagination fill in the blanks about how I was failing to meet those standards. It was genius, really, if you ignored the fact that it was slowly destroying my marriage. The crazy part was how Clara started parroting her mother's language without even realizing she was doing it. Suddenly, everything was about potential and security and building a future. When I got passed over for a promotion at work, something that happens to literally everyone at some point in their career, Clara's response wasn't the supportive "their loss, babe" I was hoping for. Instead, it was this concerned frown and a gentle suggestion that maybe I should think about developing more leadership qualities or work on building stronger relationships with upper management. These were Loretta's words coming out of Clara's mouth, and hearing them felt like being stabbed with a knife made of disappointment. My wife was looking at me through her mother's eyes now, and apparently what she saw wasn't measuring up to some invisible standard that kept getting higher every time I thought I might actually reach it. The apartment criticisms got more frequent and more pointed. Our furniture was student housing chic, Loretta's charming way of saying we lived like broke college kids instead of responsible adults. Our neighborhood was transitional, real estate speak for not good enough for my daughter. Even our grocery shopping habits became a source of commentary. Apparently, shopping at the regular supermarket instead of that overpriced organic place downtown was evidence that I didn't prioritize Clara's health and well-being. Every family gathering became an exercise in subtle humiliation. Loretta would ask pointed questions about our 5-year plan and our investment portfolio and our retirement strategy, knowing full well that people our age were mostly concerned with paying rent and maybe saving enough money for a decent vacation. She'd bring up friends' husbands who'd gotten promotions or bought houses or achieved some other milestone that highlighted how far behind I was falling in the great race of life. And Henry? That spineless wonder just sat there through all of it, nodding along like some kind of bobblehead doll programmed to agree with whatever his wife said. The man had apparently decided that keeping the peace with Loretta was more important than standing up for his daughter's happiness, and watching him enable her behavior was almost worse than dealing with the behavior itself. But the real kicker was seeing the change in Clara. My confident, independent wife was slowly transforming into someone who second-guessed every decision and looked to her mother for validation on everything from what shoes to buy to what we should have for dinner. The woman who'd once told me she loved our little life together was now constantly measuring it against some impossible standard that her mother had constructed and finding it wanting. Each conversation with Loretta left Clara a little more distant, a little more critical, a little more convinced that maybe she'd settled for less than she deserved. And the worst part was, I could see it happening, but I had no idea how to fight it. How do you defend yourself against accusations that are never actually made? How do you prove your worth to someone who's already decided you're worthless? You know what they say about walking into a trap? By the time you realize what's happening, you're already screwed 6 ways from Sunday. That's exactly how I felt when Clara announced we were going to her parents' house for dinner with some of Loretta's friends. She said it so casually, like she was mentioning we were out of milk or that it might rain later. Mom's having Marjorie and Felice over, and she thought it would be nice if we joined them. Nice, right? Because nothing says, nice evening, like being fed to a pack of suburban wolves who measure a man's worth by his credit score and country club membership. I should have known something was up when Clara spent an hour getting ready and kept asking me if I was sure my shirt was appropriate. When your wife starts treating dinner at her parents' house like it's a job interview, that's usually a pretty good sign that you're about to walk into some kind of social execution. But like the trusting idiot I was, I just assumed she wanted to look good for her mom's friends. Sweet, naive Marcus, always ready to give people the benefit of the doubt right up until they used that doubt to beat him over the head. The Whitmore house was in full display mode when we arrived, looking like something out of Better Homes and Gardens if that magazine catered exclusively to people who thought showing off was a competitive sport. Every surface was gleaming, every flower arrangement was perfectly positioned, and I'm pretty sure Loretta had actually polished the doorknobs. This wasn't just dinner. This was theater, and I was apparently the evening's entertainment. Marjorie and Felice were exactly what you'd expect from women who spent their days lunching and their evenings gossiping about whose husband was cheating and whose children weren't living up to their potential. They were both north of 50, perfectly coiffed, and wearing the kind of jewelry that suggested their husbands had either inherited money or figured out how to steal it legally. These were women who could destroy a reputation with a raised eyebrow and considered passive aggression an art form. Marjorie was the taller of the two, with silver hair that probably cost more to maintain than my monthly salary and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had that whole ice queen thing going on, the kind of woman who could make small talk feel like a cross-examination. Felice was shorter and rounder, with the deceptively warm demeanor of someone who'd perfected the art of delivering insults wrapped in compliments. Together, they were like the mean girls from high school, except they'd grown up and gotten better at being terrible. Dinner conversations started innocuously enough. We talked about the weather, which had been unseasonably warm, and about the new restaurant that had opened downtown, which apparently served portions that were too generous for people with refined palates. I should have known we were heading into dangerous territory when Marjorie started asking about my family background with the kind of interest that suggested she was either writing my biography or building a case against me. So Marcus, she said, cutting her salmon into precise little pieces like she was performing surgery. Clara mentioned you grew up here in town. How lovely that you have such deep roots in the community. The way she said deep roots made it sound like I'd been planted here against my will and was now slowly strangling the life out of the local ecosystem. That's when I made my first mistake. See, I was actually proud of my childhood, proud of the fact that my dad had built his mechanic shop from nothing and that my mom had worked her ass off to help people in the hospital. So when the conversation turned to family traditions, I mentioned how my dad used to take me fishing at Miller's Lake every weekend when I was a kid. It was one of my favorite memories, just me and the old man, sitting on the dock with our lines in the water, talking about life and baseball and whatever random thoughts popped into our heads. The silence that followed my little nostalgic trip down memory lane was so thick you could have cut it with a knife and served it as an appetizer. Marjorie and Felice exchanged one of those looks that women have perfected over centuries of civilization, the kind of wordless communication that can convey an entire conversation in the space of a heartbeat. It was the look of two predators who'd just spotted wounded prey. "Fishing," Felice said finally, like I'd confessed to some embarrassing medical condition. "How rustic." And there it was, the first drop of venom, delivered with a smile that could have melted steel. "I don't think I've been fishing since I was a child." Such a simple pleasure. Loretta, who'd been unusually quiet up to this point, decided this was her moment to join the feeding frenzy. "Marcus comes from very grounded people," she said, and somehow managed to make grounded sound like a terminal diagnosis. "His father runs a garage downtown, and his mother works at the hospital. Very honest, working-class folks." The way she said working class made it clear that in her social hierarchy, we ranked somewhere between street sweepers and professional mourners. The conversation spiraled downhill from there faster than a toboggan on an icy slope. Every story I told, every memory I shared, was met with the kind of polite interest you'd show a child who was explaining how they'd built a fort out of couch cushions. When I mentioned that my dad had taught me how to work on cars, Marjorie actually giggled, and said something about how handy I must be around the house. When I talked about my mom's dedication to her patients, Felice nodded sympathetically and murmured about how noble it was that some people were called to service professions. Clara sat through all of this like she was watching a tennis match, her head turning back and forth between me and her mother's friends. But she never once jumped in to defend me or change the subject. She just sat there, fork in hand, letting these women dissect my life like it was some kind of sociology experiment they were conducting for their own entertainment. The coup de grace came when Henry brought out the wine for dessert. It was some fancy vintage that probably cost more than I made in a week, and Marjorie started going on about this wine-tasting trip she and her husband had taken to Napa Valley. "We stayed at this absolutely divine little vineyard," she gushed. "The kind of place where you can really appreciate the finer things in life, you know?" And then, like a shark smelling blood in the water, she turned to me with that predatory smile. "Do you and Clara travel much, Marcus? I imagine it's difficult on a limited budget." That's when I knew I was completely and utterly screwed. These women hadn't invited me to dinner. They'd invited me to my own public execution. Every question, every comment, every seemingly innocent observation had been designed to highlight exactly how much I didn't belong in their world. I was the outsider, the interloper, the working-class schmuck who'd somehow tricked their precious Clara into marrying beneath her station. After dinner, while Clara was helping clear the dishes, Loretta cornered me in the kitchen like a spider who'd finally gotten her prey exactly where she wanted it. The mask of polite hostility she'd been wearing all evening finally came off, and what was underneath was pure, undiluted contempt. "Let me be very clear with you, Marcus," she said, her voice low and deadly calm. "You are nothing without Clara. You're a mediocre man living a mediocre life, and my daughter deserves so much better than what you can give her. You're holding her back from the kind of future she could have, the kind of life she was meant to live." She stepped closer, and I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with the scent of victory. "Do yourself a favor and walk away before you ruin her future with your ordinariness." I stood there, jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack, but I didn't say a word. What was I supposed to say? How do you defend yourself against someone who's just told you that your entire existence is essentially worthless? Loretta's eyes glittered with triumph as she watched me struggle with the urge to either scream at her or just walk out of the house and never come back. That's when I saw it. That look of complete satisfaction, like she'd just accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. She'd wanted to break me, and in that moment, staring at her victorious smile, I realized she might actually have succeeded. You know that moment in horror movies when the protagonist finally realizes they're completely screwed? When all the pieces fall into place and they understand that the monster has been hunting them all along, and now it's time for the final showdown. Well, congratulations. You just witnessed me having that exact moment in Loretta's kitchen. The drive home was quieter than a funeral parlor at midnight, and I spent every mile trying to figure out how to tell my wife that her mother had basically declared war on our marriage. Clara chatted about the dinner like it had been some kind of lovely social gathering instead of the character assassination I'd just endured. Marjorie is so interesting, isn't she? And did you see Felice's necklace? Mom said it was an anniversary gift. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her mother's friends had spent the entire evening treating me like I was some kind of exotic zoo animal that had accidentally wandered into polite society. By the time we got home, I felt like I'd been put through an emotional meat grinder. Every muscle in my body was tense. My jaw ached from clenching it so hard. And I had the kind of headache that comes from spending 3 hours pretending you're not being slowly tortured by people who think psychological warfare is a dinner party game. But I knew I had to tell Clara what had happened. I owed her that much, and honestly, I still believed that my wife would have my back when it really mattered. Sweet, stupid Marcus. Still thinking love could overcome a mother's manipulation. We sat down on our ancient couch, the one that creaked like an old ship in a storm, and I took a deep breath. Clara, we need to talk about tonight. About what your mother said to me. I told her everything, word for word, trying to keep my voice steady and calm even though I felt like screaming. I explained about the looks Marjorie and Felice had exchanged, about the way they'd made every story I told sound like evidence of my inadequacy, about how the whole evening had felt like a setup designed to make me look small. And then I got to the kitchen conversation. Your mother cornered me while you were clearing dishes, I said, watching Clara's face for some sign that she was as outraged as I was. She told me I was nothing without you. She said I was mediocre and that I was holding you back from the life you deserved. She actually told me to walk away before I ruined your future with my ordinariness. I expected anger. I expected Clara to be furious that her mother had ambushed me like that she'd crossed every line of decency and respect. I expected my wife to grab her phone and call Loretta immediately to tell her that she was completely out of line and that she needed to apologize and back off. Instead, Clara got quiet. Not the good kind of quiet where someone's processing information and getting ready to unleash righteous fury on your behalf. This was the bad kind of quiet, the kind that makes your stomach drop and your palms sweat because you suddenly realize you might be fighting this battle alone. Maybe Mom just worries that we come from different worlds, she said finally, and those 8 words hit me like a freight train loaded with disappointment. Different worlds. As if growing up in the same town, going to the same high school, and building a life together wasn't enough to bridge whatever imaginary gap her mother had created between us. Different worlds, I repeated, trying to keep the disbelief out of my voice. Clara, we live in the same world. We share the same bed, the same dreams, the same life. The only difference is that your mother thinks my family's money came from paychecks instead of trust funds. But Clara just shrugged, and in that small gesture, I saw everything I needed to know about where her loyalty really lay. She wasn't going to defend me. She wasn't going to call her mother and demand an apology. She was going to rationalize Loretta's behavior and find ways to justify the unjustifiable because that was easier than standing up to the woman who'd been pulling her strings since birth. The next few days were like living with a stranger who happened to look exactly like my wife. Clara went through the motions of our normal routine, but there was this distance between us that hadn't been there before. She'd look at me sometimes with this expression I couldn't quite read. Not disappointment, exactly, but something close to it. Like she was seeing me through her mother's eyes now and finding me wanting. The conversations got shorter. The silences got longer. When I tried to talk about work or our plans for the weekend, she'd respond with these polite, distracted answers that made it clear her mind was somewhere else entirely. Probably back at her mother's house, reliving that dinner and wondering if maybe Marjorie and Felice had a point about my prospects and potential. Then came the night that changed everything. We were sitting at our tiny dining table, the one that wobbled because one leg was slightly shorter than the others, eating takeout Chinese food like we had 100 times before. But instead of the comfortable domesticity we'd always shared over dinner, There was this thick tension in the air that made every bite taste like cardboard. Clara put down her chopsticks and looked at me with the kind of expression people wear when they're about to deliver bad news. "Marcus, I think we need to talk," she said, and my heart immediately sank because nothing good has ever followed those particular words in the history of human relationships. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the dinner at Mom's," she continued, and I could already see where this was heading. Maybe we rushed into things too fast. Maybe we didn't really think about whether we're compatible long-term. Compatible. Another one of Loretta's words coming out of Clara's mouth like a virus that had finally taken over the host's brain. "What are you saying, Clara?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she couldn't quite look at me directly, in the careful way she was choosing her words like she was defusing a bomb instead of ending our marriage. "I think I need some space," she said, and there it was. The death sentence, delivered in the kind of gentle tone people use when they're putting down a sick animal. Some time to figure out what I really want. What kind of future I'm looking for. Space. Time to figure things out. Future considerations. Every phrase was straight out of the Loretta Whitmore playbook for destroying your daughter's marriage without getting your hands dirty. Clara wasn't even trying to come up with her own reasons for leaving. She was just recycling her mother's arguments like they were her own original thoughts. "This is about your mother, isn't it?" I said, and for the first time in days, Clara looked directly at me. There was guilt in her eyes, but also something harder. Something that looked disturbingly like resolve. "This is about us," she said. "About whether we really have a future together or if we're just settling for something comfortable instead of something extraordinary." Extraordinary. Jesus. Even her vocabulary had been colonized by her mother's ambitions. The woman who'd once told me that our little life together was perfect was now looking for something extraordinary, something that apparently couldn't be found in our hand-me-down furniture and takeout dinners and Sunday walks through the park. I watched my wife pack her suitcase that night, folding clothes and packing toiletries like she was going on a business trip instead of walking out on our marriage. She moved with this determined efficiency that suggested she'd been planning this moment for days, maybe weeks. How long had she been thinking about leaving? How many conversations with her mother had it taken to convince her that I wasn't enough? When she got to the door, suitcase in hand, she turned back to look at me one last time. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she said, and I think she actually meant it. "I hope someday you'll understand." But I understood perfectly. Months after our wedding, after all the promises and vows and talk about forever, my wife was leaving me because her mother had convinced her she could do better. Because Loretta's voice had finally drowned out mine. And in the competition for Clara's heart, I'd come in second place to a woman who'd never wanted me in the family to begin with. As the door closed behind her, I did something that surprised even me. I laughed. Not the kind of laugh that comes from joy or amusement, but something darker and more bitter. The kind of laugh that bubbles up from the depths of your soul when you realize that everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty and marriage was just a beautiful lie you'd been telling yourself. It was a hollow, scary sound that echoed through our empty apartment, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was laughing or crying or just finally losing what was left of my mind. But one thing was crystal clear. The woman I'd married had just chosen her mother over her husband, and I was completely and utterly alone. You know what's funny about rock bottom? It's not actually as dramatic as people make it out to be in movies. There's no epic soundtrack playing in the background, no slow-motion montage of your life falling apart, no wise mentor showing up to offer profound advice about picking yourself up and dusting yourself off. Real rock bottom is just you, sitting in an empty apartment that still smells like your ex-wife's perfume, staring at two pathetic suitcases that contain everything you apparently own in this world, wondering how the hell you got here and what you're supposed to do next. That's exactly where I found myself the morning after Clara walked out. The apartment felt like a crime scene, every corner holding memories of the life we'd built together, or thought we'd built together. Her coffee mug was still in the sink from that morning, lipstick stain on the rim like some kind of cruel reminder that just 12 hours ago, I'd still been a married man. The indent from her pillow was still visible on the bed we'd shared for months, and her half of the closet gaped open like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. I spent about 10 minutes wallowing in self-pity, which is apparently my personal record for feeling sorry for myself before my practical side kicks in and starts making lists. 2 suitcases of belongings, a checking account that wasn't exactly overflowing with cash, and a friend named Jonah who'd offered his spare room about 6 months earlier during one of those late-night conversations where you say things like, "If you ever need anything, man, just call me." Well, guess what, Jonah? It was time to find out if you actually meant that. Jonah Miller had been my roommate in college, back when we were both young and stupid and thought beer was a food group. He'd gone into software development after graduation and had somehow managed to turn his ability to speak computer language into a decent living. More importantly for my current situation, he bought a house in a neighborhood that was gentrifying just enough to be trendy, but not so much that normal people couldn't afford to live there. "Dude, what the hell happened?" was his eloquent response when I showed up at his door looking like I'd been hit by a truck full of emotional baggage. I gave him the short version. Wife left, mother-in-law from hell. Need a place to crash until I can figure out my next move. Jonah, being the kind of friend who asks questions later and helps first, immediately started clearing out his spare room, which had been serving as a combination home office and storage unit for exercise equipment he never used. "Stay as long as you need," he said, moving a dusty treadmill that looked like it had been used exactly once. "But I'm warning you right now, Tessa's going to want to feed you constantly and probably try to set you up with every single woman she knows." Tessa was Jonah's girlfriend of 2 years, a kindergarten teacher with the kind of nurturing instincts that made her treat every problem like it could be solved with homemade soup and a good heart-to-heart conversation. She proved Jonah right within the first 24 hours. I woke up to the smell of bacon and eggs, stumbled into the kitchen like a zombie who'd forgotten how to function as a human being, and found Tessa standing at the stove with a plate already prepared. "Eat," she commanded, pointing at the table with a spatula like it was a weapon. "You look like you've been living on nothing but coffee and disappointment for the past week." The thing about people who care about you is that they can see through your bullshit even when you're trying really hard to convince everyone, including yourself, that you're fine. Tessa took one look at me and immediately went into full mother hen mode, which was both annoying and oddly comforting. She'd slide plates of food in front of me when I'd get so lost in my own head that I'd forget meals were a thing. She'd leave little notes around the house reminding me to do basic human maintenance like showering and doing laundry. It was like having a personal life coach who happened to smell like vanilla and baked goods. But the hardest part wasn't the practical stuff, it was the nights. Those long, quiet hours when the rest of the world was asleep and I was lying in Jonah's spare bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how everything had gone so spectacularly wrong. The silence was brutal. No Clara breathing softly beside me. No familiar sounds of someone else sharing my space. Just me and my thoughts and the occasional sound of traffic outside the window. I'd replay conversations in my head, analyzing every word Clara had said in those final weeks, looking for clues I'd missed or signs I should have seen. Had she been planning to leave for longer than I thought? Had I been so blind to what was happening that I'd missed obvious warning signs? Was Loretta right about me being mediocre and holding Clara back from something better? That last question was the one that really messed with my head. Because here's the thing about psychological warfare, it works. Even when you know someone is trying to manipulate you, even when you can see their tactics clearly, the poison still seeps in. Those late-night thoughts were like having Loretta's voice on repeat in my skull, asking me all the questions I didn't want to answer about my worth as a husband and as a man. Work became my salvation, which is ironic considering I'd always thought of my job at the insurance company as just something I did to pay the bills. But suddenly, dealing with other people's problems and paperwork became a refuge from dealing with my own emotional wreckage. I started volunteering for every overtime shift available, staying late to finish projects that didn't really need to be finished that day, basically doing anything to avoid going back to Jonah's spare room and confronting the reality of my situation. My colleagues probably thought I'd developed some kind of workaholic disorder, but the truth was simpler and more pathetic. Work was the only place where I felt like I had some control over my life. At the office, I knew what was expected of me. I could handle claims and process paperwork and solve problems that actually had solutions. It was a nice break from my personal life, where nothing made sense and every problem seemed designed to make me question everything I thought I knew about myself. Slowly, very slowly, I started to rebuild some kind of routine. Morning coffee with Jonah before we both headed off to work. evening walks around his neighborhood, partly for exercise and partly because walking helped quiet the noise in my head. Weekends spent helping him with house projects, because apparently there's something therapeutic about fixing other people's stuff when your own life feels completely broken. The breakthrough came about 6 weeks after Clara left, when I realized I'd gone an entire day without thinking about her or Loretta or any of the mess they'd left behind. It was a small victory, barely worth mentioning, but it felt huge. Like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life replaying the worst moments of my marriage and wondering what I could have done differently. That's when I started looking for my own place. Not because Jonah and Tessa weren't amazing. They were probably the best friends a guy could ask for during the worst period of his life, but because I needed to prove to myself that I could stand on my own 2 feet again, that I could build something new from the wreckage of everything I'd lost. The apartment I found was small, just a one-bedroom in a complex that was clean but not fancy, affordable but not cheap. It had good natural light, a decent kitchen, and most importantly, it was mine. No shared memories, no ghosts of conversations that had gone wrong, no reminders of a life that had been built on a foundation that turned out to be made of sand. Moving day was surprisingly cathartic. Each box I packed, each piece of furniture I arranged, each nail I hammered into the wall felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd lost somewhere in the wreckage of my marriage. This wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was a life I was choosing, and that made all the difference in the world. You know what they say about karma. She's a patient lady, but when she finally shows up to collect what's owed, she doesn't mess around. It took about 3 months after Clara walked out for me to start hearing the first whispers that maybe, just maybe, the grass wasn't quite as green on the other side of that fence she'd jumped over. And let me tell you, after months of wondering if I was the problem, if I really was as mediocre and inadequate as Loretta had made me feel, hearing that Clara's perfect new life was falling apart was like getting a shot of pure vindication straight into my bloodstream. The intel came from the most unexpected source, the cereal aisle at Kroger, of all places. I was doing my weekly grocery shopping, living that thrilling bachelor lifestyle of frozen dinners and energy drinks, when I literally bumped into Evan Whitmore. Clara's younger brother had always been the reasonable one in that family, the kind of guy who stayed out of drama and just wanted everyone to get along. He was standing there looking at boxes of Lucky Charms like they held the secrets of the universe, and when he saw me, his face went through about 15 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. "Oh, hey Marcus," he said, and I could practically see him debating whether to pretend he hadn't seen me or to actually engage in conversation. "How've you been, man?" The question sounded genuine, which was more than I could say for most interactions I'd had with the Whitmore family over the years. "Can't complain," I replied, which was mostly true. Sure, my life had been turned upside down and shaken like a snow globe, but I was starting to find my footing again. "How about you? How's everyone doing?" I asked the question casually, but I'll admit I was curious as hell about what was happening in the Whitmore household now that their golden daughter was free to pursue her extraordinary life. That's when Evan got that uncomfortable look that people get when they know more than they want to share. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, looked around the grocery store like he was afraid the cereal boxes might be recording our conversation, and then leaned in closer like he was about to share state secrets. "Look, Marcus, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but..." He paused, clearly wrestling with his conscience. "Things haven't been going so great for Clara lately. Or for Mom, for that matter." The way he said it, with that mix of concern and something that might have been regret, made it clear that whatever was happening at the Whitmore house wasn't exactly the triumphant success story they'd all been expecting. Apparently, Clara's brilliant plan to leave her mediocre husband and upgrade to something better had hit a few snags. The first problem was financial, which shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone who'd been paying attention. See, Clara had quit her job at the boutique about a month after our wedding, figuring that married life meant she could take her time finding something more suitable to her new status as Mrs. Marcus Ellison. The plan had been for me to carry the financial load while she explored her options, maybe took some classes, found her true calling, or whatever. But when she left me, that safety net disappeared faster than free beer at a college party. Suddenly, Clara found herself unemployed in a job market that wasn't exactly crying out for people whose main qualification was used to work at a clothing store but quit because my husband was supposed to support me. The boutique job was long gone, filled by someone who actually needed the work, and Clara discovered that her liberal arts degree and brief retail experience weren't exactly opening doors to the kind of career that could support the lifestyle she thought she deserved. She's been looking for work for months, Evan told me, glancing around nervously like he was worried his mother might materialize out of thin air and catch him gossiping. But everything she's qualified for pays about what she was making before, and that's not exactly what she had in mind when she left. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Clara had walked away from our marriage because she thought she deserved something extraordinary, and now she was discovering that extraordinary usually requires extraordinary qualifications, which she definitely didn't have. But the financial problems were just the beginning. The real kicker was that Loretta, the mastermind behind Clara's divorce decision, was now stuck footing the bill for her daughter's newfound independence. Clara had moved back in with her parents temporarily, while she figured out her next move, which meant Loretta was now supporting a grown woman who'd been convinced to throw away a perfectly good marriage in pursuit of something better that didn't actually exist. "Mom's not happy about it," Evans said, which was probably the understatement of the century. I could just imagine Loretta's reaction to discovering that her brilliant plan to free Clara from her mediocre husband had resulted in Clara becoming financially dependent on her parents instead. The woman who'd spent months criticizing my ability to provide for her daughter was now providing for her daughter herself, which must have been about as satisfying as a root canal performed with rusty pliers. Even Henry, who'd spent our entire marriage pretending he was invisible whenever conflict arose, was apparently starting to lose his patience with the situation. According to Evan, their father had started making pointed comments about grown children who needed to support themselves and the importance of taking responsibility for your decisions. For a man who usually communicated in grunts and nods, this was practically a declaration of war. "Dad's been asking when she's going to get back on her feet," Evan continued, looking increasingly uncomfortable with every word. "And Mom keeps making excuses, but you can tell she's getting frustrated too. They had this big fight last week about Clara's car payment, and Mom ended up storming out of the house." The mental image of Loretta having a public meltdown over her daughter's financial problems was almost too delicious to be true. But wait, there's more. Because apparently, Clara hadn't just been sitting around her parents' house feeling sorry for herself. She'd been trying to put that extraordinary life plan into action, which included attempting to rekindle things with some old boyfriend from high school. You know the type. The guy who'd been captain of the football team or student body president or some other big shot who'd peaked in high school and had been coasting on those memories ever since. "Remember Danny Morrison?" Evan asked, and I did remember him. Danny had been one of those guys who thought he was God's gift to womankind because he could throw a football and had nice hair. He'd gone to college on some minor athletic scholarship, studied communications or business or some other generic degree, and had come back to town thinking he was going to set the world on fire with his mediocre talents and overinflated ego. Clara started hanging out with him a few weeks after she moved back home. Evan continued. "Mom was thrilled, of course. Danny's dad owns that car dealership out on Highway 9, so she figured he was a step up from." He trailed off, realizing he was about to say "from you," but the implication hung in the air like a bad smell. The Danny situation had apparently been Loretta's dream come true. Finally, her daughter was dating someone from the right kind of family, someone with prospects and connections, and all the superficial qualities that mattered in Loretta's twisted value system. For about 2 weeks, the Whitmore household was probably buzzing with excitement about Clara's bright future as the wife of a successful businessman. Then reality set in. Turns out Danny Morrison was about as substantial as cotton candy in a rainstorm. He was still living with his parents at 32, still talking about all the big deals he was going to make someday, still convinced that his high school glory days qualified him for greatness he'd never actually achieved. The relationship fizzled faster than a cheap firework, leaving Clara right back where she started. Unemployed, living with her parents, and no closer to that extraordinary life she'd been promised. It lasted maybe 3 weeks, Evan said, shaking his head. Danny turned out to be kind of a loser, if you want to know the truth. Still acts like he's 17 and thinks the world owes him something. The irony was almost too perfect. Clara had left me because her mother convinced her she could do better, and her first attempt at better turned out to be worse than what she'd had in the first place. But here's the part that really got to me. According to Evan, Clara was starting to realize what a massive mistake she'd made. The extraordinary life her mother had promised her was nowhere to be found, and the ordinary life she'd thrown away was looking better and better in the rearview mirror. She'd started asking questions about me, wondering how I was doing, whether I was seeing anyone, if I seemed happy or bitter or broken by what had happened between us. She asks about you sometimes, Evan admitted, looking like he immediately regretted sharing that information. I think she's starting to understand that maybe she made a mistake. A mistake. That's what our marriage had become in Clara's mind. Not a betrayal or a tragedy, just a mistake, like buying the wrong size shoes or ordering something gross at a restaurant. Standing there in the cereal aisle, listening to Evan describe the spectacular failure of Clara's post-divorce life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Genuine satisfaction. Not the bitter, angry kind of satisfaction that comes from wanting to see someone suffer, but the quiet, confident satisfaction that comes from knowing you were right all along. I hadn't been the problem in our marriage. I hadn't been mediocre or inadequate or any of the other things Loretta had convinced Clara I was. I'd been a good husband to a woman who'd been convinced she deserved better, and now she was discovering that better didn't actually exist. Life's got this weird sense of timing, you know? Just when you think you've got everything figured out, or at least figured out enough to function like a semi-normal human being, it throws you a curveball that changes everything. Not necessarily in a bad way, mind you, but in one of those ways that makes you realize you've been playing the game with half the rules missing. That curveball came in the form of Sophie Chun, and she walked into my life at exactly the moment I least expected it and most needed it. It was my colleague Jake's 30th birthday party, which was being held at this trendy little bar downtown that served craft cocktails with names like The Existential Crisis and Midlife Awakening. The kind of place where the bartenders had beards that required daily maintenance, and the music was just loud enough to make conversation slightly difficult, but not impossible. I almost didn't go, because honestly, the idea of making small talk with a bunch of people from work while pretending to be socially functional felt about as appealing as a root canal performed by a drunk gorilla. But Jonah had basically forced me out of the apartment, using his patented combination of guilt trips and threats to physically drag me there himself. "You've been hermit ng for months, dude," he'd said, blocking the TV screen where I was attempting to lose myself in a Netflix binge that had reached embarrassing proportions. "You need to remember how to interact with humans who aren't me and Tessa. Plus, there's going to be food, and you know how you get when you don't eat actual meals." So there I was, nursing a beer that cost more than my lunch, and trying to look like I was having a good time at this birthday celebration for a guy I barely knew outside of work-related conversations about insurance policies and claim processing. I was standing near the bar, doing my best impression of someone who was totally comfortable being alone at a party, when this woman walked up and ordered a drink that was apparently so complicated it required a 5-minute explanation to the hipster bartender. "Let me guess," she said, turning to me while she waited for her cocktail masterpiece to be constructed. "You're here because someone made you feel guilty about staying home, and now you're calculating exactly how long you need to stay before you can escape without seeming antisocial." She had this smile that was equal parts knowing and mischievous, like she'd just read my mind and found it mildly entertaining. Sophie Chun was the kind of woman who could probably read people like they were books written in large, simple fonts. She worked in marketing at a tech startup downtown, which explained why she could afford drinks with ingredient lists longer than most grocery store receipts. But more than that, she had this energy about her. Not the manic, exhausting kind that makes you want to hide in a closet, but the warm, genuine kind that makes you remember what it feels like to actually enjoy talking to another human being. "How did you know?" I asked, and immediately felt stupid for being so transparent. But Sophie just laughed, not the polite, social obligation laugh that people do at parties, but a real laugh that made her eyes crinkle at the corners and made me realize I'd forgotten what it sounded like when someone found me genuinely amusing instead of just tolerable. "Because you've been standing in the exact same spot for the past 20 minutes, holding the same beer, and you keep checking your phone like you're hoping for an emergency that would give you an excuse to leave," she said, accepting her complicated cocktail from the bartender. "Plus, You have that look that guys get when they've been guilted into social situations by well-meaning friends who think isolation is a disease that can be cured with exposure to loud music and overpriced alcohol. We ended up talking for the rest of the party, which shocked me more than anyone else in attendance. Sophie had this way of asking questions that made me want to answer them honestly, instead of giving the standard small talk responses that reveal absolutely nothing about who you actually are. She asked about my job, but not in the way people usually do at parties, where they're just waiting for you to finish so they can tell you about their job. She seemed genuinely interested in what I did, how I'd gotten into insurance, whether I actually enjoyed it, or if it was just something that paid the bills. Insurance adjustment, she said, nodding thoughtfully. So basically, you're the guy who has to tell people whether their lives can be put back together after something terrible happens to them. It was such a perceptive way to describe what I did for a living that I actually stopped mid-sip of my overpriced beer and stared at her. That's actually a pretty accurate way to put it, I said. Most people just assume I push papers around all day and deny claims to save the company money, which was technically true, but Sophie had somehow identified the part of my job that actually mattered, helping people navigate one of the worst days of their lives and hopefully making it a little bit better. When the party started winding down and people began making those polite noises about early mornings and long drives home, Sophie asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. Not in the way people usually ask that question at parties, where it's just something polite to say before you forget each other's names by morning, but like she actually wanted to see me again. Like maybe our conversation had been as unexpectedly enjoyable for her as it had been for me. There's this place near my office that makes coffee so good it's basically a religious experience, she said, pulling out her phone to exchange numbers. Plus, they have these pastries that are probably illegal in several states because of how addictive they are. What do you say we find out if you're as interesting over caffeine as you are over craft beer? We met up the following Wednesday at a little coffee shop that was exactly as amazing as she'd promised. The kind of place where they actually cared about things like water temperature and grinding techniques, and where the pastries looked like they'd been created by artists who just happened to work in flour and butter instead of paint and canvas. Sophie was waiting for me when I got there, already armed with 2 cups of something that smelled like heaven and looked like it could power a small city. For the first time in months, I found myself laughing without any underlying bitterness or cynicism. Sophie had this way of finding humor in everyday situations that wasn't mean-spirited or sarcastic, but genuinely funny. She told stories about her coworkers, her family, her adventures in online dating that had led to a string of disasters so spectacular they could have been turned into a sitcom. But more than that, she listened when I talked, really listened, not just waiting for her turn to speak. Around the same time that Sophie was becoming a regular part of my life, something interesting happened at work. My boss, Mr. Patterson, called me into his office on a Friday afternoon, which usually meant either terrible news or incredibly boring administrative stuff that couldn't wait until Monday. I was prepared for a lecture about paperwork or a reminder about some policy change that would make my job slightly more tedious. Instead, Patterson offered me a promotion. Not a huge, life-changing advancement, but a step up to senior adjuster with a decent raise and some actual responsibility for training new hires. "You've been putting in excellent work these past few months, Marcus," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The extra hours, the attention to detail, the way you've been handling the difficult cases, it hasn't gone unnoticed." The raise wasn't fortune-level money, but it was enough to make me feel like I could breathe again, like maybe I wasn't just surviving paycheck to paycheck anymore. More than that, it was recognition that I was actually good at what I did, that my work mattered and was valued by people who understood what quality looked like. Meanwhile, the gossip network that had kept me informed about Clara's post-divorce struggles was continuing to provide updates, and the news wasn't getting any better for the Whitmore family. Through Evan and a few mutual acquaintances, I learned that Clara's job search was still going nowhere fast. She'd had a few interviews, but nothing had panned out, and the longer she went without finding work, the more desperate and depressed she was becoming. The most satisfying piece of information came through Tessa, who'd heard it from her friend Monica, who worked at the salon where Clara had been getting her hair done since high school. Apparently, Clara had tried to rekindle things with yet another ex-boyfriend. Some guy named Trevor, who'd moved back to town after his startup in Austin had crashed and burned. But Trevor, it turned out, was dealing with his own financial and personal problems, and the last thing he wanted was a relationship with someone who came with as much baggage as Clara was carrying. He basically told her he wasn't looking for anything serious right now. Monica had reported to Tessa, who'd then passed it along to me with the kind of gleeful satisfaction that comes from watching karma work its magic. Said he needed to focus on getting his life back together before he could think about dating anyone. Clara was apparently devastated. The irony was so perfect it was almost poetic. Clara had left me because her mother had convinced her she deserved someone more ambitious, more successful, more capable of giving her the extraordinary life she thought she was entitled to. But every guy she'd tried to date since then had been either a complete loser or too smart to get involved with someone whose life was falling apart at the seams. As I sat in that coffee shop with Sophie, listening to her laugh at some stupid joke I'd made about the dangers of trying to operate heavy machinery before consuming adequate caffeine, I realized something that probably should have been obvious months earlier. I was happy, not the desperate, grasping kind of happiness that comes from trying to convince yourself you're fine when you're really not, but genuine contentment with where my life was heading. The promotion, the new relationship, the slow but steady rebuilding of my confidence and self-worth. It all added up to something that felt suspiciously like the life I was supposed to be living. Not the extraordinary life that Loretta had convinced Clara she deserved, but something better than extraordinary. Something real. You know how in horror movies, there's always that moment when you think the monster is finally dead, and the hero's walking away all relieved and victorious, and then bam, the damn thing pops up one more time for the obligatory jump scare? Well, welcome to my personal horror sequel, because just when I thought I'd successfully escaped the toxic wasteland of my former marriage, Loretta Whitmore decided to make her grand reappearance in my life. And let me tell you, desperation does not look good on that woman. It started with unknown numbers popping up on my phone at random times throughout the day. At first, I figured it was telemarketers or those scam artists who call to tell you your car warranty is expiring. So I did what any rational person does with unknown numbers. I ignored them. But these calls were persistent in a way that went beyond normal spam phone behavior. We're talking 10, 15 calls a day, at all hours, like someone had decided that harassment was a legitimate communication strategy. The first voicemail I actually listened to nearly made me drop my phone in shock. It was Loretta's voice, but not the cold, controlled Loretta I remembered from family dinners and kitchen confrontations. This version of Loretta sounded like she'd been put through an emotional blender and reassembled by someone who'd never seen a human being before. Her voice was cracked, desperate, with this underlying wobble that suggested she'd been crying recently and was trying really hard not to start again. Marcus, it's Loretta Whitmore. I need to talk to you about Clara. She's not doing well, and I think maybe we made a mistake. Please call me back. This is important. The message ended with what sounded suspiciously like a suppressed sob, and I sat there staring at my phone like it had just grown tentacles and started speaking in ancient Latin. Loretta Whitmore, the woman who'd spent months systematically destroying my self-worth and convincing my wife I was human garbage, was calling me for help. The same woman who'd told me I was nothing without Clara, who'd sneered at my family's blue-collar background and made it clear that I wasn't good enough to breathe the same air as her precious daughter, was now begging me to save that same daughter from the mess they'd created together. The audacity was so staggering, it was almost impressive. Almost. I deleted the message and went back to my life, which was actually going pretty well. Thank you very much. Sophie and I had been dating for about 2 months, and she was everything Clara hadn't been. Independent, supportive, genuinely interested in me as a person rather than as a project to be improved or abandoned. We'd started spending most weekends together, doing normal couple things like trying new restaurants and arguing about what to watch on Netflix, and having the kind of easy, comfortable conversations that don't require you to constantly monitor yourself for signs of inadequacy. But Loretta wasn't giving up that easily. The calls kept coming, sometimes from her number, sometimes from numbers I didn't recognize, sometimes from what I eventually figured out was Clara's phone. The voicemails got progressively more desperate and pathetic, like listening to someone's mental health deteriorate in real time. Marcus, please, I'm begging you. Clara won't eat. She won't leave her room. She just sits there crying all the time. She keeps saying she ruined her life, and I don't know what to do anymore. You're the only person who can help her. Please call me back. Then there were Clara's messages, which were somehow even worse than her mother's. At least Loretta maintained some semblance of coherence, even in her desperation. Clara's voicemails sounded like they were being delivered by someone who'd been drinking wine for breakfast and had given up on the concept of human dignity entirely. Marcus, it's me. I know you probably hate me, and you have every right to, but I need to talk to you. I miss you so much, and I keep thinking about our apartment and those Sunday walks we used to take, and I made such a terrible mistake. Everything is falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it. Please call me back. I love you. Love. She was talking about love now, after months of silence, after walking out on our marriage because her mother had convinced her she could do better. It was like watching someone try to put toothpaste back in the tube. Desperate, messy, and ultimately impossible. The calls came at all hours. Early morning, late at night, during my lunch break at work, while I was having dinner with Sophie. My phone would buzz, and I'd see another unknown number, and I'd know exactly who was on the other end, probably sitting in the Whitmore kitchen with tears streaming down her face, dialing my number like it was some kind of prayer that might magically fix everything she'd broken. After about 2 weeks of this psychological siege warfare, I started blocking numbers. First Loretta's, then Clara's, then whatever random numbers they were using to try to get around my defenses. But these women were nothing if not resourceful in their desperation. They'd call from Henry's phone, from Evan's phone, from numbers I didn't even recognize, but could identify by the unmistakable sound of sobbing on the voicemail. The letters started arriving about a week after I'd blocked most of their phone numbers. Real, old-fashioned letters, delivered by the postal service like we were living in some kind of Victorian novel where people still communicated through written correspondence. The first one was from Clara, 3 pages of handwritten emotional carnage that read like a suicide note crossed with a romance novel written by someone having a nervous breakdown. She wrote about how much she missed me, how sorry she was for listening to her mother, how she realized now that I was the best thing that had ever happened to her, and she'd thrown it all away because she was stupid and selfish and didn't deserve my forgiveness, but was hoping for it anyway. The letter was stained with what I assumed were tears, because apparently Clara had decided that emotional manipulation through postal service was the way to win back the husband she'd abandoned. Loretta's letters were more strategic, less emotional, but somehow even more disturbing. She included Clara's resume, as if the problem with Clara's life was simply that she couldn't find employment rather than the fact that she'd systematically destroyed her marriage based on her mother's toxic advice. She wrote about how much Clara regretted her decision, how they'd both learned their lesson, how much they needed my help to fix the situation they'd created. I know I said some things that were hurtful, she wrote in one particularly galling example of understatement. But I was only trying to protect my daughter. I can see now that I was wrong about you, and I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive us both. Wrong about me. As if the problem had been a simple misunderstanding rather than months of systematic psychological abuse designed to destroy my marriage. The most surreal moment came when Loretta actually showed up outside my office building one afternoon, clutching a manila envelope like it contained the secrets of the universe. I was leaving work, looking forward to meeting Sophie for dinner at this new Italian place we'd been wanting to try, when I spotted her standing near the parking garage entrance like some kind of well-dressed stalker. She looked terrible. The perfectly put-together woman I remembered had been replaced by someone who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her hair was still styled, her clothes were still expensive, but there was something desperate and unhinged about her entire demeanor that made me want to call security. "Marcus, please, just give me 5 minutes," she said, rushing toward me with that envelope clutched against her chest like a shield. "I have Clara's resume, and I thought maybe you could help her find something at your company, or maybe you know someone who's hiring. She's really qualified, and she just needs a chance to get back on her feet." The woman who'd spent months telling me I wasn't good enough for her daughter was now asking me to use my professional connections to help that same daughter find a job. The same woman who'd criticized my career, my prospects, my ability to provide for Clara, was now treating me like I was some kind of employment savior who could rescue Clara from the consequences of her own decisions. I took the envelope, not because I had any intention of helping Clara find a job, but because I was genuinely curious to see what qualifications Loretta thought her daughter had that would make any employer want to hire her. The resume was a masterpiece of creative writing. patting Clara's brief retail experience and college education into something that looked almost impressive if you squinted, and ignored the giant gap in employment that corresponded exactly with the duration of our marriage. I'll see what I can do. I lied, because sometimes it's easier to give desperate people false hope than to explain why their problems aren't actually your problems anymore. Loretta's face lit up with relief and gratitude, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the kitchen conversation, the dinner party ambush, the months of systematic undermining that had led to the destruction of my marriage, and any sympathy I might have felt evaporated like steam from a cup of coffee. These women had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. The fact that those consequences were turning out to be more unpleasant than they'd anticipated wasn't really my problem anymore. I had my own life to live, my own relationships to build, my own future to focus on. The calls kept coming, but I'd stopped listening to the voicemails. The letters kept arriving, but I'd started throwing them away unopened. Loretta's number would flash across my phone screen late at night, and I'd watch it ring until it went to voicemail, then delete the message without playing it. Because for the first time in my adult life, I was learning what it felt like to have boundaries, to say no to people who'd spent months making it clear that my happiness was less important than their comfort. And you know what? It felt pretty damn good. The final showdown came on a Tuesday evening when I was least expecting it, which is probably exactly how karma intended it. Sophie was in my kitchen making dinner. Some amazing pasta dish that smelled like heaven and required actual cooking skills I definitely didn't possess when the doorbell rang. Not the polite, single chime of a normal visitor, but the desperate, repeated buzzing of someone who'd clearly abandoned any pretense of social etiquette. I opened the door to find Clara and Loretta standing there like some tragic mother-daughter tableau, both looking like they'd been put through an emotional wood chipper. Clara's eyes were red and swollen. Mascara streaked down her cheeks in what I'm sure she thought were photogenic rivulets of remorse. Loretta's perfectly coiffed exterior had crumbled into something that looked genuinely unhinged, her hands shaking as she clutched her purse like a life preserver. "Marcus, please," Clara started, but I held up my hand because I was done listening to speeches about regret and second chances and all the other bullshit people say when they realize they've royally screwed up their lives. Behind me, Sophie's voice called out from the kitchen, asking if I wanted her to set the table for two or if we were expecting company. The look on Clara's face when she realized I'd moved on, that I wasn't sitting around pining for her like some lovesick teenager, was almost worth all the months of harassment and manipulation. I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me, because whatever this conversation was going to be, Sophie didn't need to witness it. "You chose this," I said calmly, looking directly at both women who'd spent months making my life miserable. "And now you get to live with it." For once in her life, even Clara didn't have an argument. They turned and walked away in silence, and I knew with absolute certainty that this chapter of my life was finally, mercifully closed.